ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode 3 of the Security Consultant Insight series with MySecurity TV. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor and Director for MySecurity Media, and we're joined by our panel. We have Dr. David Brooks, Sara Trimboli, and Rachell Deluca. Thank you very much for joining us. Very good. I'm just going to run through our intros as we do week to week. Just some events, and then we're going to hear from Sara first, then we'll hear from David, and then Rachell as well. Let me just do the intros. Thank you. So MySecurity TV, our focus is aerospace and space, national security and defence, cybersecurity and critical technology, and cities and infrastructure. And we're just starting to do some live stream TV as well, and we're going to be streaming out to YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. I did a little test earlier today, and despite a bit of a lag, it seems to work okay. So this is going to be a consistent thing that we do, probably Tuesdays and Fridays each week. We'll also be doing these types of series as well. This particular series is kind of part 1, high security buildings, installations, standards, and fire considerations, which is a 4-part series with about a good half a dozen consultants. And as I mentioned, introducing Dr. David Brooks, Sara Trimboli, and Rachell Deluca. So we're going to be looking at the PhysSec15 and PhysSec16 policies with Sara, intelligent building management systems with Dave, and then the challenges to maintaining security design integrity after builder novation with Rachell. So looking forward to this. On Thursday, I interviewed Jeff Raby, Australia's former ambassador to China, and we did a virtual book review. Goes for about 40-45 minutes, quite interesting, and definitely some good ideas and points of view, I suppose, and gives that Australian-China perspective, which is worth having a listen to. So welcome to check that out. On this week, Corinium is with the CISO Online Asia. It goes for the next couple of days, today through to Friday. On tomorrow in Perth, we've got the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce. This is at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and they've got a live feed from Michael Zolotov. He's the CTO with Razer Labs, and that session's been supported by Microsoft. Canalys Forum is on this week. In fact, it looks like for the next 2 weeks. So Canalys looks at the channel sector for the technology market. Normally, these events are held in different parts of APAC. They're also held in Europe and the Americas. So you'll hear more from that when we start to report. I've got a meeting this afternoon in Singapore with that one. This week also, we're going with the New South Wales Government, courtesy of, thank you, with the Bengaluru Tech Summit. Starts on Thursday through to Saturday with presentations from Prime Minister Modi, and I believe Scott Morrison is going to give a presentation at this one too. So this is probably one of the better tech summits at a high level in India. Also coming up, I'll just rip through these, Friday 27th of November, and then the 1st of December, and then the 4th of December. We're doing looking at Malaysia's National Telecom Cybersecurity. So I've got the CEO from Cybersecurity Malaysia with us. We've got VP of ANZ with Ubico, Jeff Schomburg, looking at the Australian cybersecurity strategy and what it means for Australian company directors. And we're doing a bit of a giveaway there for the 5CI clears, the passwordless devices. And then we've got Louisa Vogelenzang, who's with Kroll, and looking at data breach notification as well. And these will be sort of the live stream versions of these webinar sessions. And then I've got a few more in the pipeline. We're doing one with Alcid on Active Directory security, AlgoSec, which is a sort of network security policy provider, CyberArk on privileged access management, Accenture, we're looking at the cybersecurity threat landscape and their report, and Milestone Systems on facial recognition. Also, I think it's on the 10th of December with Cyber Risk Meetups, once again with Shemaine Tan, and she's got a CISO from the US tuning in. And ISACA, if you're an ISACA member, their virtual conference is just getting listed now onto the marketplace. So all these events are on the marketplace, as well as a bunch of others. Cyber Risk magazine, I believe it should be in the download. So if you want to download this magazine, it's about 16 articles with a focus on cloud and link out to our Indo-Pacific series. Welcome to check that out. And yeah, let me know if you have any issues downloading that, but otherwise it's free on the marketplace. So look, thank you so much to our expert consultants. We are covering off on high security buildings, balancing fire safety and security. So thank you to Richard for his presentation last week, and specs and standards, and then also we'll touch on practical completion. So I'm just forgetting which slides are coming up next. Okay, so these series, this particular series is sponsored with AMS Australia and their self-latching lock monitoring box, the 333. These brochures are also available for download, and we've done a bunch of videos and sort of cut them down on YouTube as well. But I'll play, I think I'm going to play the secure under door seal at the end of this session to close it out. It goes only for a few minutes anyway. But yeah, if you're into lock and door hardware, and the panel generally is, you'll find those reasonably interesting. So look, that's pretty much it from me. Just on this series, Kevin Foster and Mark Jarrett kicked off with episode 1, looking at the SCEC requirements, and then also the Handbook 188 with Standards Australia. Last week, we did a panel session with 6, although Sarah had to drop out at the end, but and then we had a presentation from Richard on the fire consideration. So these sessions are available for viewing on YouTube. And today, I'm going to hand over now to Sarah. And for the audience Q&As, if you want some questions, you're welcome to just post them on, and then I'll moderate that as well. I get a little message that you've asked a question. Sarah, are you okay to, if I hand over to you?
Yep.
Great.
Yep.
Here it comes.
Okay. All right. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, look, I just wanted to start by saying a thank you to Chris for organising this high security building webinar. Yeah, appreciate the invitation. It's a privilege presenting in this forum amongst other, such high caliber security consultants. So, yeah, as Chris mentioned, I'll be presenting on the Protective Security Policy Framework, or PSPF, and specifically PhysSec15 and 16, which are policies that direct government agencies in meeting their physical security obligations. As SCEC consultants, we need to be across these policies, and in particular the requirements of what we refer to as security zones, which is something I'll detail later on in the presentation. Okay, so I'll just go to the next slide. Yeah, so just an overview of the PSPF. It's a framework and policy developed by the Attorney General's Department, which describes how protective security is to be applied across federal government agencies and defence. The overall intent of the framework is to ensure the secure and continuous delivery of government business. So the PSPF is a large document, and it covers the application of the various aspects of protective security. So we've got governance, personnel security, information security, and physical security. Again, as SCEC consultants, our main focus is, and where we assist our government clients is in relation to physical security. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'll focus on the physical security elements of the PSPF. Okay, so the physical security section of the PSPF focuses on a key outcome, which is each entity provides a safe and secure physical environment for their people, information, and assets. There are 2 policies within it, PhysSec15 and 16. So 15 focuses on physical security for entity resources. And by entity resources, we're essentially talking about people, information, and assets, physical assets. And 16 focuses on the organisation's facilities. So this includes I guess, various physical attributes such as the construction, security technology, alarm systems, access control, and vulnerabilities. So I'll go into detail on PhysSec15. So PhysSec15 starts off with a core requirement, which is all agencies must implement. So it's all about managing risk and specifically managing risk of harm to people, information and physical assets of government organisations. So when it comes to entities' information and physical security assets, what we're trying to achieve is really twofold. We want to protect them from being made inoperable and inaccessible so we can undertake business continuity, and we also want to protect them from getting into the hands of unauthorised people. Okay, so how do we do that? First off, we need to identify the entity's resources in the categories of people, information, and physical assets. So identifying an organisation's people assets is pretty straightforward, but I'll go into information and physical assets and how we identify those. When it comes to identifying information assets, the PSPF has an InfoSec8, which is a specific policy on information security, and it describes in great detail how the organisation's information needs to be identified and classified. I won't go into it, but essentially it just describes how agencies need to classify, handle, process, discuss, transmit and dispose of and store their information. Okay, and finally we need to identify our physical assets. When it comes to physical assets, we need to first identify the assets based on these categories, so valuable, classified, important, attractive, significant, or dangerous. Okay, we've identified all our resources, people, information, physical assets. What do we do next?
Can I just interrupt there? Attractive. Maybe I haven't seen that term before. Maybe have an explanation for attractive. I kind of can guess what it is, but.
Yeah, I guess something that might be, I can give an example, I guess an old device that may have been used in war, for example, a museum piece might be, might not be valuable, but might be attractive to other people, but, it could cause harm. That could be an example.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess really what we're looking at is something that is attractive to other people to
to steal or to attack or something like that, right?
Yeah. Okay, now I've lost my
Sorry.
Here we go. Right, so we've identified our resources. Yep. Okay, so we've identified all our resources. Now we're required to protect them, and the way we protect them is we first assess the business impact level of their loss, compromise, or loss, compromise, or damage. What we refer to is the business impact level, or BIL. So the term BIL is I'll be referring to that term quite a fair bit. So once the agency has identified its asset, it needs to assess the business impact level if the asset was to be compromised, lost, or damaged. According to that assessment, the asset is assigned a BIL ranging from 1, which is the lowest impact, to 5, which is considered catastrophic. All right, so we've identified our entity resources and assessed their BILs. Next is to work out measures to protect our resources. We've got here a list, a wide range of measures that entities can adopt to protect their information and physical assets. I won't go through all of them because we'll be here all day, but I'll just touch on 2 specific protection measures entities can apply, which are just of interest to me. So the first is, the Security Construction and Equipment Committee, SCEC, is a body which evaluates security equipment or products for their suitability for use by Australian government. These products could really range from anything like keys or locks, alarm systems, cabinets, etc., even envelope seals, and SCEC assign a security level to these products, and they range from security level 1 or SL1 through to SL4, providing the highest level of protection. Okay, and the other protection measure I wanted to touch on is audio security. This is applicable in areas where classified discussions are held, and in this situation, there needs to be audio separation between the room where these discussions take place and adjacent spaces. So in these instances, there's documentation in the tech notes and on the standards which provide general advice on how to achieve sound separation. However, generally SCEC consultants work with specialist acoustic engineers who input to the design of a facility to achieve the required outcomes, and then the acoustic engineer is able to come in once the treatments are in place and actually audio test the separation. In fact, that's what I did today with a colleague at 5 a.m. in the morning, so it's been a big day. Okay, yeah, so that was it for PhysSec15. I'll move on to PhysSec16. So again, we start with a core requirement that all government agencies must apply. This particular core requirement is centred around applying appropriate physical security measures to an entity's facilities. So item A here, and we actually, I think the panelists spoke about it last week. Entities need to integrate protective measures throughout all the stages of a facility's life cycle, starting right from the planning stage, so that security forms a part of the facility's brief and really becomes embedded in the facility's design and operations. Item B requires that agencies handling sensitive or classified information must really only do so within what we refer to as security zones, which have been designed and built in accordance with the appropriate ASIO tech notes. We'll go into security zones in more detail later on. And item C states that security zones must be accredited. And again, we'll go into it later on. Okay, so this is the core requirement of PhysSec16, and I'll just touch on some of the keywords because it's fairly detailed. I've highlighted planning. So the PSPF recommends that agencies develop a site security plan for new facilities or refurbishments which consider the security needs of the organisation from a facilities perspective, and this should really happen at project inception. Next kind of keyword is selecting. The PSPF recommends that site suitability be assessed and whether the organisation's security needs can be achieved at the location being assessed. So factors to consider might be neighbourhoods, standoff distances between the site and like adjacent spaces, site access and parking, and environmental risks and the like. Okay, so when designing or modifying an agency's facility, not only does the security needs of the facility need to be considered right from the start of the process, but agencies also need to put in place a range of security measures which collectively serve to protect the organisation's people, information and assets. This is where we come back to, I guess, some of the very basics of protective security in PhysSec16. So we need to apply a combination of physical, procedural, and even governance measures. And we need to put in place a range of measures that deter, detect, delay, respond to, and recover from security breaches. So I guess fundamental security. Okay, and the next keyword I'll go through this in a lot more detail, is security zones, which is, I guess, one of the core fundamental parts of being a SCEC consultant. So security zones are restricted access areas according to 5 security zones, with increasing restrictions and access control as the zones progress from zone 1 through to zone 5. ASIO Tech Notes 115 and 512 are a set of standards developed by ASIO, and they describe the minimum requirements that need to be applied in order for it to be accredited to a particular zone. So these requirements cover the various attributes of the area. Example, it's construction, access control measures, alarm systems, keying, locking, operational, etc. So I'll go through the zones, starting with Zone 1. This is the lowest security level. It's usually publicly accessible. Sensitive and security classified information or assets ranging from bill of low to medium levels can be used or even potentially stored. Higher sensitive or classified resources aren't recommended. An example of a Zone 1 would be just a public foyer or a reception area. Okay, Zone 2. This is probably the most common zone. It's just normally just general office area. Sensitive and security classified information assets with a bill of up to high may be used or stored in these spaces. Extreme bill resources, they may be used in these areas but rarely stored. Extreme or higher would be stored in a higher zone. So these spaces are restricted to the public, and there's unrestricted access for authorised personnel.
And I noticed there's also working from home there, Sarah.
Yeah, I can go through all of them, but we'll hear all
well,
that.
I noticed that must have been quite a big uptake during COVID-19 when everyone started to have to work from home.
To be honest, the requirements of Zone 2, I'll be honest with you, I was surprised when I saw that as well. I'm not sure how the average home could achieve that, but I won't go into the details, but there are restrictions, and I don't know if every home can achieve Zone 2, to be honest. But,
fair enough.
Anyway, I'll keep going. Zone 3. So sensitive and security classified information and assets of bill up to extreme may be used and stored in Zone 3, but catastrophic bills cannot be. There's no public access into Zone 3. Visitors must be escorted, and there's restricted access for authorised personnel. Right, it's a little bit repetitive, so I'll fly through.
Yep, go.
We're getting more and more, higher security, so no public access. Only visitors who have a need to know, restricted access for authorised personnel with appropriate security clearance this time, and bill of up to extreme, but again, we can't store catastrophic bill resources in Zone 4. And finally, Zone 5, and I'll fly through again, it's highly restricted, no public access, only escorted need-to-know visitors. In this particular case, we need dual authentication to get in. That means either access control and card, or access control and PIN, or access control card and biometrics to get into a Zone 5. And in this particular instance, bills are up to catastrophic may be used or stored in Zone 5. And these are areas, if they're appropriately accredited, authorised staff may handle top secret or sensitive compartmented information in these areas as well. Right, so that's a high-level overview of what zones are. And this is a very busy slide, but it just gives a really good overview of the attributes associated with each of the zones. So on the columns, all the zones are listed. So if you can see my mouse, Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3, Zone 4, and Zone 5. And on the rows, we've got the various attributes. So
nice and easy for you.
Yeah, so what we can see, I won't go through each one, but we can see that the lower zones have less requirements than the higher zones. So I
do have a question here. Maybe pick out air gaps. Where would you need an air gap?
Yeah, so, well, zone 2 and onwards, there's two answers there. With air gaps, you want them when you're trying to achieve audio security, that the greater the air gap you have, the greater the sound the sound separation. So if for highly audio secure rooms, we like to have air gaps. But when it comes to, I think maybe you might be referring to apertures or openings into the zone. We, for example, ducts and the like, we really need to minimise those in accordance with the standards. But that element comes down to building construction, and you can see that there's these tech notes which describe in detail the specific building construction of the zones. They are restricted documents, so I won't go into great detail, but essentially the higher the zone, the more restrictions there are and the more requirements there are.
And I've got one more question, sorry, Sarah.
Yeah.
The biometrics that you prefer, is there a preference on biometrics, facial, hand, fingerprint?
Yeah, look, it's really down to it really comes down to the end user's needs. So, for example, in a laboratory, you wouldn't want people touching, so it might be, more non-contact might be more appropriate, etc. And, vice versa, some people might not want their faces. It just really comes down to horses for courses, I suppose. Yeah.
Have you noticed a change this year in biometrics in terms of what might be getting put in? Has COVID, do you think, really changed the way biometrics are being approached now?
I think COVID has really changed everything, to be honest.
Fair enough.
We're seeing all sorts of things. Everything's changed, and but yeah, I guess so. I guess everything's changed in terms of COVID. But what I wanted to point out specifically is something that is special to Zone 5s, and it's this thing called Technical Surveillance Countermeasures, TSCM. And again, back to audio security, rooms which where discussions regularly need to have TSCM, which is a suite to check for bugs or listening devices. So at the start of any top secret conversations, they do a check for any bugs, and also during the construction. So that's something that's quite interesting. I think I've got one more slide.
Go.
Which is essentially security zones need to be certified and accredited before they're used operationally. Zones 1 to 4, the CEO can certify them. So with certification, we're looking at each of the separate control elements and whether they've been applied appropriately. And then once all those things are done, with the certification with the Zone 4 and 5, there's a Type 1A security alarm system which needs to be certified by a SCEC endorsed consultant. But once all the bits and pieces are certified, then the CTO, or the Chief Security Officer, compiles all the info and reviews all the risks and the various certifications, and they accredit the zone as appropriate for use. And then in the event of a Zone 5 also needs to be certified by ASIO and accredited by Australian Signals Directorate as well. So I think that's the end of the presentation, Chris.
Right.
I can stop there. Yeah.
Wonderful. And just on that slide, something that came up last week was there's only about 80 or so SCEC consultants. So if anyone's listening to run on the courses, it would be good to run a few more, I think. And Sarah, we spoke, there's not many women on that list. Of that, about 80, there's only about 4 women.
Yeah, I actually counted after our conversation. Right. There's 86 men and 4 women. So I think it's about 5%.
Wow. So, yeah, it's very interesting. And thank you to Rachel, because when I spoke to Rachel, it was like, okay, how do I find a female sort of SCEC consultant? And so thank you to Rachel to finding you as well, because the list isn't published anymore or open. So you're in a unique group there, which is a bit of a shame. But so thank you very much for that session.
No worries.
David, let's hand over to you. And I like the way kind of this is structured itself. Looking at the policy framework here, you're going to talk about intelligent buildings because it'll always, there will be sort of segues there for you. Let me hand over to you. And you should get a prompt now.
Right, thanks Chris, I received that, one moment.
Great, we've got your notes there, that's it.
Right.
Great, thank you David.
Thanks Chris, and I'd say it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. I think this is, what I'd like to talk about over the next 15 minutes is a research funded project that I think, as you alluded to, Chris, ties in really well, not only from sort of managing risks in the built environment, but also the use of guides and standards, how we integrate that into our strategies. So this was a research funded project that was supported by ASIS Foundation, which is a not-for-profit arm that focuses on research from ASIS International, the Security Industry Association, SIA, and the Building Owners Managers Association, or BOMA. Those three associations collaborated together, identified that these systems were a problem for the built environment, for organisations, and particularly for their members. And it's an interesting mix because these member groups cover sort of the whole diverse stakeholders of responsibility of these systems. So what I'd like to talk about is really just give you a bit of a snapshot of what is an intelligent building system. That leads quite nicely into what are some of the security problems, both from a technical perspective, but also from a knowledge and application aspect. And that will lead into how can we mitigate the risks to our organisation. And then I'll finish off with a very, very brief recommendation. I want to take a very non-technical discussion because this is a technical system, but the problem isn't necessarily with the technology per se, it's about our knowledge and the various stakeholders' knowledge and how we then apply strategies to manage these systems. So what are intelligent building systems, or more correctly, building automation and control systems? Now, in our research, we were sort of initially looked at this from an intelligent building perspective. When you actually look at these systems, there's no single definition that defines what these systems are. And they're called many things, from energy management systems, building management systems, to intelligent building systems, to smart buildings, and now smart cities. But the issue with that is language is always a problem, and we've seen this over the last sort of 20 years of research at Edith Cowan Security Science Group. So we sort of diverted to what we believe is a more technically correct, not from a technology perspective, but from a broad stakeholder perspective, in calling these systems BACs. I say there's no definition, but there's certainly a number of common characteristics that sort of articulate these systems being a BAC system, and that's they integrate discrete and disparate plant and equipment or systems within the built environment, and they tend to do that on a shared common network. And by putting those systems over a shared common network, it allows a degree of automatic monitoring and control. The other important aspect, I think, is the ability to have free flow of information, and that's vital for these systems. That free flow of information goes to some sort of central control and monitoring point that used to be very static, now is very mobile and dynamic. In other words, we may have a building engineer sitting on the workstation using this data from this information from the systems. Alternatively, we may have a third-party maintainer on a Sunday afternoon and received a call from your building saying there's a problem with the building. They log into the system and can generally rectify or do some sort of workabouts. I think it's that sort of free flow of information is really important, and in my view is BACS provides a significant benefit to the building owner. They don't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars putting these systems in if there wasn't a cost benefit in putting these systems in. They also provide a significant benefit to the operators of the building. And we tend to think of these systems being there to reduce energy consumption, about energy efficiency, but they're also about sustainability. And what really came to light during the research was the aspect of occupancy on buildings, which was actually a sort of a leading driver. And nowadays we've got regulatory requirements that sort of drive the need for these systems. So a bit of a snapshot of an overview of these systems. These are sort of primarily made up of 3 levels. The sort of heart of the system is the automation level, and the heart of that level is controllers, just input-output devices, black box that gets spread throughout the facility. These controllers are in plant rooms, they're in electrical risers, they're in roof spaces. We can have 1 or 2 of those in a system. We can have hundreds of these systems in a system, depending on the size and complexity of the system. They have input-outputs, they have embedded programming and memory devices onto those. But they're connected. They're all connected, either through some sort of physical network connection or through a wireless connection. Sitting below that are the input-output devices, the eyes, ears, and hands of the system. So that can be a sensor, for instance, a temperature sensor, an airflow monitor. It can be a passive infrared sensor. So when I walk onto my floor or into my office, the lights come on, the HVAC turns on, and so on. Or it can be a passive infrared that fulfills a security function. From an output perspective, there's activators. So again, that could be fan control, and that can be a fan controller, that can be a valve for heating and cooling, or it can be a door lock. Sitting above the automation level is the management level. The management level is how we as users and operators of this system interact with the sort of automation level. So again, we have a building engineer, they'll be on their workstation, they'll log into the BACS software, they'll then connect to the automation level. From there, they can view the programming, make relevant changes, and upload the events that occurred over a period of time. That allows them to do the analysis, hence the sort of free flow of information from all the subsystems. So as with any system, they're vulnerable to attack. And they're vulnerable from both a logical and physical perspective, and they're vulnerable at each level. So as part of the research, we identified 40 generic vulnerabilities. I haven't listed them all, and I don't necessarily plan to sort of talk about them per se. But they are spread across all 3 levels. What we sort of came to the conclusion was really the risk lies at the automation level. Not the field device, fairly isolated, fairly discrete, limited impact to the broader back system, and even the management level. There's generic mitigation strategies all in place. The real risk lied at the automation level. And again, give you a quick example, the controllers are spread throughout the floor, throughout the building, throughout the site. If I can get access, both wirelessly or physically access to that, I can get to the controller, the cover unclips. They're generally not in a robustly secured enclosure. They don't have any tampers applied to them. They have input-output switches for the output devices. These are designed for maintenance. So I want to be able to turn the fan off, turn the fan on, turn it to auto. The inputs aren't line supervised, so I can manipulate the inputs. I can download the software. These are sort of open protocol systems programmed in English. So I can download free software online. I can load it to my laptop, plug it into the controller, and in essence, if there isn't a protection in the controller, upload its program, make changes, download the changes, see what's happening in the facility. Once I get to one controller, I get to the whole system. So there's a risk. Now, we identified during the research project 97 mitigation strategies that align to these sort of 40 vulnerabilities. But we quickly realized that we can give you a list of 97 mitigation strategies as a guidance document, but what is the value to you to have almost 100 mitigation approaches? We also want to have a better understanding of what the practitioners are doing out there. In other words, does the security manager get involved in these systems? What are their understanding? And we wanted to cover all the different stakeholders within the system. So as part of the project, we actually sent out just under 14,000 surveys. We got a 2.5% response. Sounds really poor, but actually for this sort of survey, really good. And one of the questions we asked was, out of the 40 vulnerabilities, we selected 23, and we selected 23 from very low impact, as we saw it, to very high impact. And we asked the participants of the survey to rate that from, is this critical or not very critical? And the response we got from security practitioners and facility operators, i.e. facility managers, was that table on the right-hand side, a very neutral response. So it didn't matter what the vulnerability was. They took a fairly risk-averse approach and said everything's significant, everything's the same. Compared that to what we found was sort of an expert group being in cybersecurity professionals and integrators. Again, the same 23 vulnerabilities, how they rated the same vulnerabilities. Some were significant, some were not so significant. Now, when we compared those, there's significant difference from there. So that quickly highlighted to us that we need to sort of produce a guideline document that really not only aids people, but educates people on these systems and give them the tools to actually operate. So what we in essence did was take those 97 mitigation strategies and turn those into questions. We also realized that every floor, every build, every site's different, depending on what happens from the organisational aspect. So as we developed the guide, we quickly realised that we can't define the context. Only you, as the operator of that building, stakeholder in that organisation, can define the context. So we took a criticality assessment approach, in as much as we broke the criticality assessment down into 8 discrete areas. And a smaller organisation may only do the criticality assessment for operations, but a large one may take multiple categories. And that ranged from operations to occupancy, which was big for facility managers and facility side, to things like reputation, safety, and information. So that allowed the facilitator of this process to really identify their organisational criticality level. Now, if they rated it at that low and had the assessment at low, they could then start addressing the 97 mitigation strategies. Again, we turned those mitigation strategies into questions, and we themed them up from management, personnel security, to cyber security, to community and maintenance, because BACS covers the whole building, covers the whole organisation, and there's multiple stakeholders in the process. So again, if you rated your building as low, you really answer 39 questions over the 8 categories from, and these are quite generic. They're not unusual in any way, and most organisations, in my view, should have these already in place. For instance, do you have a security policy? Through to, from a maintenance perspective, have you got a backup of your BACS program, and is it stored security offside? So there's 39 questions in there. If you rate your site as moderate, you go through all these level 1 questions, then you go through all the level 2. If you rate it critical, you go through all the questions, all the 97 questions that need to be addressed. And very much as Sara mentioned earlier, from the Australian government perspective, as you go through the zones from low up to high, it becomes more onerous and more difficult to apply in essence. And for this guideline, a lot more focused into BACS. So for instance, at the most critical level, there's 11 questions. They're very BACS focused, and they start with, do you do a specific threat assessment on your BACS, all the way through to when you got maintainers coming onto site, they're escorted at all times. They've been cleared and checked, but they still get escorted at that level. So sort of takeaway recommendations, I could talk for a while. I'm conscious of time. I suppose the only recommendation I like to make is please Google Intelligent Building Management Systems Guidance for Protection Organisation, and you'll come across this guidance document. It's 13 pages. It takes you through a step-by-step guide of how you do the assessment, criticality assessment, what is BACS and its technology, and it then gives you a list of questions to ask based on how critical your operational organisation is. So it takes you through a step-by-step guide. One thing I will say is when we're sort of doing the focus groups in this and we're talking to the expert group being integrators, a lot of their comments was they're third-party providers. When they make recommendations to their organisation as clients, they're seen as trying to upsell, and there may be a degree of that. But from our research, they've really understood, I suppose, the vulnerability and how do we manage that. I think a reasonable sized organisation should have a BACS working group that includes the security manager, cyber security or IT, facility manager, and so on, to really assess what they need to do across the whole organisation. I'll put the links up to the guidance from the 3 associations, and I'm going to finish here. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, David. Ollie's sending quite a few questions through. Ollie, we can't get to all of them, but maybe just give us an example of what, say, the mitigation strategies would be. What type of mitigations and sort of the level of detail you might go into.
I'll just jump back to here. So, at the lower level, they're very generic, and they're not necessarily focused on BACS wholly. So things like level 1 endorsed security policy. It's very, very simple. Most organisations have that. The other ones are things like personnel pre-employment screening. 2, are your controllers physically secured? Again, I've seen a change over probably the last 5 years with these sort of systems. As I go around and talk to different building engineers, facility managers, their requirement to lock up things like plant rooms and electrical enclosures and so on, really, I think, coming from a safety aspect, but for the protection of these, it provides that sort of the initial degree of protection that doors aren't open, that when I walk into a plant room, I see all the controllers sitting there. I have to have a key to get into that electrical enclosure to get to these controllers.
It's still very common to find that. I think the other thing with these guidelines, and for the audience, there is a podcast David and I did, I think maybe last year, if not the year before, on the guidelines. We go in a bit of detail, but it's to be sort of filled out by the security practitioner as well as the facility manager, isn't it, to get the different perspectives? It
is. I think someone needs to take the lead on that. Again, from my and it's interesting because part of that sort of broader understanding of these systems, what we found was very, very few people actually take any responsibility of these systems. It tends to be the building engineer. So we found sort of 1 to 2% saying, I take responsibility of these systems. Very focused, but their focus is on maintenance and maintaining occupancy for the building. Security becomes a 2nd, 3rd, 5th thought for them. So that's why I think as a sort of broader aspect, if there's any issue in the organisation, to have that working group where the various stakeholders get involved, whether the security leads that, whether it's IT or whether the facility guys lead that. But it needs some sort of lead.
Yeah.
But it's got to be across the whole organisation, across multiple stakeholders.
It is always hard depending on what classification the building has and the occupants as well as to who will drive that. And it's been something sort of consistent so far in this series as well.
And I'll tell you what the real problem comes is when you've got a government agency in a public building and they have 1 or 2 floors of that public building. Below them sits, say, an admin organised company that's processing paperwork, bookkeeping, and there's an extreme of requirements, but it's one BACS system that provides the services to both those different types of companies from a security perspective. And there's no answer, there's no clear answer to that. Do you raise a whole BACS up to that sort of higher security level, which becomes very costly and difficult?
Great. Look, thank you so much, David. And Rachel, I take it you're ready to kick right in, because again, I think it's a good segue over to you. Here it comes. So Rachel, we're going to talk about builder novation, and yeah, we can see your slides and we can still see you. So
Okay.
you can get underway. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. And before we start, I'd like to clarify the earlier conversation by saying that I'm not a SCEC endorsed security consultant. I'm not one of the 4 to 5 women who are, unfortunately. I did recommend Sara for this program because I knew that she was, and it's great to have her on board. So what I do have up my sleeve, rather than being a SCEC endorsed consultant, is considerable years working in building services design and security design and consulting. And I wanted to talk about maintaining security design integrity after builder novation. And it's quite unique to the design process where, I'll start by clarifying for what is novation. It's when you're initially engaged by one party, quite typically an architect, with a novation clause in the contract. That means you are then transferred over from the architect to the main contractor. Now that transfer takes place after the tender process and after the main contractor is appointed. So then the consultant must deliver the IFC package to the main contractor instead of their initial client, who was in fact the architect. So it's important to note that novation transfers both the rights and the obligations that were initially maintained under the original contract with the architect over to the main contractor, as well as creating a completely new contractual agreement and discharging the original one. So I'm not here to talk about the overall contract management side of things, but just more to present on what challenges that can present in security design. So there are some risks involved. As I previously indicated, the end client to the consultant is not the originally contracted entity. So what that can mean is contractual terms are not those that were initially signed up to. So that can be insurances, that can be contract risk, that can be warranties. There's a whole range of issues that could be presented as part of that process. But what that means for security design risks is that the main contractor, who is now your client, may not have been aware of the decision history that took place throughout that initial design process. And they also may have differing priorities. So what that could look like is, and what we often experience, is that those priorities are now profit-driven, with emphasis on value management of that design that was originally documented. There can be preferences for simplistic guidelines over security risk assessment, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail as we move forward. And there can be differences in security risk appetites and tolerances, again, which would be seen as means of driving down security design for value management. So how to overcome these? And this is, I will start by saying, my own methods that I've come up with over the years. And it's by no means an exhaustive list. So if anyone has any other suggestions, I'd really like to hear these, because I think it's a common problem across all consultants who are novated as part of their design process. In terms of value management and trying to overcome the new directive to drive down the costs and increase profits, it's important to recognise from the outset that the security design is going to be challenged for those reasons. So one of the things I like to do to try and gain some sort of control over this process myself is to establish and maintain documentation right from the very start of the process, the program rather, that is going to be able to just support my decisions through the design process that have gone, through the relevant stages of design prior to tender, so that I'll have justification for those later on when I know that I'll need to bring those to the table. Sometimes it's really important too to be able to benchmark your design against similar projects. If we're dealing with commercial buildings, for example, you might be able to say to a new main contractor that, well, this is what's being done in a similar site construction just down the road. Why don't we have that level of security here, for example? Being able to support your own design using that kind of content can be really valuable, and it can also show value in the design process and what you've chosen and selected as well. And also being able to demonstrate to them how the security design that you have documented achieves the design intent and the risk controls that have been established throughout the process as well. So again, maintaining the documentation there and being able to justify those choices with regard to value management, I think is really important and a really
another thing, Rachel, comments come in. Value management is a soft term for risk management because the value is avoiding risk, which could be very costly. So the value management approach, I suppose you've got to demonstrate the value of that security design, but you're trying to demonstrate that to the builder rather than the ultimate occupant or the owner as well. You've got different stakeholders there that see value in a different way, right?
Absolutely, that is definitely correct. Another challenge, just to touch on there, is that quite often the end tenant, say it's a commercial building that's multi-tenanted, some of those tenants will not have actually signed up yet. And at this stage of the process, when you're trying to value manage, you don't know what their security requirements are going to be. So it's trying to provide for everyone with a broad brush, and appreciating, of course, that if a high security government client comes in, they'll have their own requirements, which will require a whole new process. But trying to demonstrate that you can't design for the bare minimum and still expect to attract high quality anchor tenants to a building. So it's a very complex process to design for everyone without really knowing what that end picture is going to look like.
We're going to do a session on SCEC. I think SCEC is a good example where the value proposition, they don't see it at that stage in terms of the design. It's too late then as well. But yeah, keep going. Thank you.
Absolutely agreed. Right. So moving on. Pardon me. So some of the design standard preferences. A main contractor may, for example, be more comfortable using a PCA design standard or a design guideline rather for commercial buildings. Green Guide if we're talking about stadia, and then there's many other client-specific guidelines and standards that are in place for different areas, rail, energy, infrastructure, etc. Security risk assessment ideally should be applying to all facilities. In reality, I found that's not actually the case, and quite often a main contractor will expect you to just design to PCA. You know, that's the minimum, that's all you need. Anyone who's familiar with PCA guidelines, they are very basic when it comes to stipulating security controls. In terms of an access control system for a base building commercial tower, as an example, it will just say that you require proximity-based access control. That's all. It doesn't tell you where, which doors, how that should be controlled. So having that as your only basis of design will mean that there's a lot of variability in what they can say, well, that's excessive, you need to value manage that out, or no, this is acceptable. So being able to justify that design, backing it up on security risk assessment, being able to benchmark against similar buildings, that's a really effective way of demonstrating the value there as well. Again, it's about recognising that preference for a certain standard may be to drive down controls with regard to cost, and also coming back to being able to demonstrate that the security design achieves the initial design intent and the risk controls that were agreed at the commencement of the project. So when a contract is novated over between two contracted parties, the design is agreed upon at that point. So if you can justify and demonstrate that there was an initial design intent and that risk controls were agreed at that point, there is very little grounds to be able to drive down the controls and the terms of value management. Right. My final point, and I'm going to keep this short because of time, so differences in security risk appetite and risk tolerances. Again, it's only an issue when the design is documented to a lower appetite or tolerance. The best way I've found, again, coming back to the same 3 points initially to summarise on how to best mitigate these risks is, again, showing the evidence, keeping maintenance of your records of your conversations that took place earlier within the design process will enable you to really provide the evidence required to justify your design and to maintain that design integrity. Demonstrating again how it achieves the intent and the risk control, and again benchmarking against similar projects and best practice to be able to support examples. I think I found myself repeating myself quite a lot in this process, but it is really just a matter of understanding that you will be required to justify and to explain your design and to really show reasons why it doesn't need to be value managed. You might find yourself explaining different technology choices, why you should be using video analytics, for example, as opposed to a non-analytic CCTV system, and being able to demonstrate the reasons behind that and why that's of value to your clients. And it might be simplistic to say that record keeping should be taking place anyway throughout the design process. However, that's not always the case. Some of these designs can take place over 6, 8, 12 months, for example. You might have staff turnover during that time and be required to really undergo an extensive handover to make sure that you have access to all of that information. Sorry, pardon me. Excuse me, it happens when I speak too quickly. Yeah, to summarise, keep good notes, make sure that you can validate your design, and be prepared to explain yourself really, really thoroughly.
Thanks, Rachel. I always use the term cover your ass, basically, is make sure that you can always cover that is probably the best advice. And I think the other thing is, I mean, I've had a recent example of that where, you know, in the granular aspects of the specifications, either the interpretation or just due to the size of the project, little things get missed. And it's not until afterwards you have got to answer some questions or you go back to that design intent as well. So look, thank you so much. I'll bring back the session back to there. That should work. Great. So look, thank you so much and appreciate the time that you've provided as well. We're right on the hour. So there's no other sort of questions here. Ollie's been sending a lot of questions in, and Ollie, we might come back to them either next week as well. Questions around analytics, also preferences on biometrics. So I think we'll talk about that next week with a full panel and cover off on those types of things. But today, Sarah, thank you so much on the PhysSec policies. I like the audio aspects too, and the technical security countermeasures approach. Audio came up last week, I think, with the fire alarms, and then there was also airflow. So we've covered slightly different. You know, security does cover sort of different aspects of technology and science, both sound, you know, air quality, all that type of stuff as well that I find. So thank you. And David, we'll come back. I'll get a link to the guidelines as well, and we'll have them in the show notes, and I'll put a link out to that podcast that we did. Just one thing on the guidelines, how are they going? Like, have you got feedback? Are they being actively used? Because they got spread around, obviously, in the US quite broadly.
Yeah, well, internationally they got spread around, and generally really positive feedback from them. A few negative ones, but really the sort of focus on why is it taking a governance approach or compliance approach, and I think that's the sort of format of the questions. And certainly the intent wasn't to make a compliance approach; it was get people asking the questions. Yep.
And thank you very much also to Rachell on Build Innovation, and any consultants listening or eventually watch this, they'll all be able to have good case studies and stories in relation to that and the challenges that come with that also. So look, on that note, we're going to finish off. There's just double checking, no more questions. Thank you so much. So that's been about the hour. Next week we have episode 4. And we're going to have Dave, Rachell and Sarah back, but also we'll have Dr. Kevin Foster back, Richard and Fraser will also return. And we're going to discuss the smart connected buildings, precincts and cities and achieving that safety and security balance. So if anyone wants to send in questions or focus on particular areas, then you're welcome to do so. But we'll sort of touch on a little bit of what David discussed today on the vulnerability and also the design of buildings, precincts and cities. and some of the good ideas. And I think we'll probably touch on SEPTED in that context as well. So look, thank you to our sponsor, AMS Australia, and their self-latching lock monitoring box. I'm going to close off with a video. I'm going to play the secure under door seal to close off. And this session will be available on My Security TV on conclusion. I'll probably have the video up probably this afternoon, I believe. So look, thank you so much. The My Security TV, we're going to keep streaming sort of Tuesdays and Fridays, as I mentioned, and I'll have sort of guests on for one-to-one interviews regularly. And the fact that we're on LinkedIn as well is a new concept there. So look, thank you so much. I'm going to close off. Thank you to our panel. Thank you, Sarah, Rachel, and Dave. You're welcome to stay on, but what I'm going to do is move over to a video, and then the session will automatically close. So thank you very much for joining us today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. See you later.
Thanks, Bruce.
In this particular session, we're going to talk about the secure under door seal. These are often used in sort of red teaming. I'm even aware of hackers using these as an easy entrance point for vulnerable doors. This is for a high security application, so it might sound simple, but there's a lot to it. So talk us through it, Trevor.
When we originally designed the dual lock lever handle, that overcame a particular problem, i.e. a security problem and also a safety issue problem as far as actually getting out of the door with one hand, just a one-handed action. But what happened for us when we designed that problem, it was brought to my attention that it actually, although we overcame one problem,
yep,
we actually created another problem. And the other problem that we created was what they call an under-door attack. Now, from a locksmith's point of view and or from a would-be attacker's point of view, what this actually means is somebody goes underneath the door and they hook the inside of the handle with a piece of wire. Generally they use something like a coat hanger or something like that, and you pull it down and it will release the door.
But there are actually tools that do that.
Correct.
You know, and
there is actually
in the industry, yeah?
Absolutely. There's specialist tools that you can do. You can use that for, but your average person would just use whatever they could just to try and get an under-door attack and pull it down and open the door, which you could do. So what we decided to do was I decided that I would design and develop a secure under-door seal. Now, there are under-door seals on the market, but the under-door seals that are on the market are really designed for either acoustic and or dust retention or you know, to stop dust getting in or
maybe not for high security.
They're certainly not for high security. They're more aimed at the domestic market, to be perfectly honest with you, in a lot of cases. So what we decided to do was to design and develop a secure under-door seal made out of stainless steel. It has a 6mm stainless steel bar that drops down to the ground.
Yep.
It has an adjustable plunger on this end. So basically what happens is, when the door closes, the plunger is depressed and the stainless steel bar comes down to the ground. And this is
maybe talk us through this.
I'll talk you through this one. It's probably a little bit easier. So basically, as I was explaining, this is the 6mm plate here that gets pushed down to the ground when the plunger is depressed. It actually has a removable stainless steel cover, but the trick is with this cover is that you cannot get the cover off with the door in the closed position. Okay? So to get the cover off, what you have to do is you have to unwind the adjuster on the end and also take out, there's 2 screws here, 2 screws there, that once the door is closed, that's actually caught between the door stops, so you can't actually get to those 2 screws. Once those 5 items are removed, then the stainless steel cover lifts off.
Yep.
The cover itself is actually bent and folded over the back plate, which is this part here. So this part here, once you remove the cover, utilising all these fixing holes, actually fixes to the door. Once that is actually fixed to the door, then you can actually screw that in, test it out, check all the levels, and then unscrew it, slide the cover on when it's all correct, put the 2 screws in either end and close the door. If you need further adjustment at that time, all you need to do is to screw in the adjuster, and in real terms it has a little grub screw in the end there to stop the adjuster from working in or out.
And then that works against the frame and then slides that
exactly
down, right?
So the stainless steel plate is actually working on a set of sliders, so that once the stainless steel plate is down, you cannot push it back. It will not go up at all until this adjuster is actually released, and that release is as soon as you open the door. It retracts the plate, which allows you to open the door. Because one of the main things with these is that we had to get an instant release on the underdoor seal, otherwise it would start dragging on whatever the floor material is, whether it's carpet or tiles or whatever it happens to be. So it has to release. So when you actually open the door, within the first 2 or 3 millimetres of opening, the actual underdoor seal has released and the door can then be opened without any scuffing or marking on the frame here.
Yeah.
And obviously that would be for any floor coverings or anything that you had.